I am going to start welcoming people. We already have 100 people in this webinar room. Welcome to this amazing book event where our beloved leader, Daniel Sokatch of NIF, will talk to us with Juliette Kayyem. And we will learn about the re-release of his book and also how we can, in fact, talk about Israel, especially with our loved ones over the Thanksgiving table. So again, my name is Elisheva Goldberg. I am the Deputy Vice President for Communications and Policy at the New Israel Fund, but I am not the star here. You will be hearing from two stars, Daniel Sokatch and Juliette Kayyem. So this is a really, really exciting NIF event. I'm so happy that people are joining, and I'm still seeing the numbers rise. It's a really good pre-Thanksgiving moment for all of us. And it's very auspicious to have these two people here with us to again discover and uncover how we can talk about Israel with our families and friends. And so I'm going to introduce our speakers and just one moment about NIF. And then I'm also just going to tell you all of those people who are still joining and all of those people who are already here, and we're so happy to see you here, that Juliette and Daniel have been friends for a very long time. And so I think that this is going to be a very exciting conversation between the two of them. I'm told also that Daniel, when he first released this book back in 2021, had his first book event with Juliette. And so this is a reprise now that the book is being re-released with some extra special new additions, very necessary given what has been going on in the last few years. And so I'm really excited for this conversation. So I'm just going to say one note about the Q&A. Our incredible moderator, Juliette, will be speaking with Daniel for the first 40 minutes or so, and then I will be monitoring the chat, and I will call the questions as they come in, and I will pass them to Juliette. So as you have a question, feel free to message the Q&A board, and I will bring those questions to Juliette so that she can have Daniel answer them. And again, at the end of this, we will all be much better equipped, I am sure, to talk about Israel this Thanksgiving and well into the future. So here are the bios of our wonderful guests. Daniel Sokatch. Daniel Sokatch has been the CEO of the New Israel Fund since I've been there for sure, but definitely even beforehand, since 2009. During the past decade of extraordinary challenges under Daniel's leadership, NIF has risen to new heights and has been on the forefront of the fight for justice, democracy, and equality in Israel. And I'll just name that NIF is the engine of civil society in Israel. We support a variety of organizations that do incredible work to support those things, justice, democracy, and equality. And I'm sure we'll get into more of that. But back to Daniel. Before joining NIF, Daniel served as the executive director of the Jewish Community Federation of San Francisco, the Peninsula, Marin, and Sonoma counties. Before that tenure, he was the founding executive director of the Progressive Jewish Alliance, which is now known as Bend the Arc. In recognition of his leadership, Daniel has been named 4 times to the Forward newspaper's Forward 50, an annual list of 50 young leaders and decision makers and opinion shapers. He has contributed articles to leading papers and magazines, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Forward, Haaretz, and of course, he is the author of the book that we are talking about, Can We Talk About Israel? A Guide for the Curious, Confused, and Conflicted. He has an MA from the Fletcher School of Tufts University, a JD from Boston College, Law School, and a BA from Brandeis University. He's married, the father of 2 daughters, and lives in San Francisco. Juliette Kayyem. In academia, the private sector, government, and media, Professor Juliette Kayyem is an international leader in crisis management and homeland security. Professor Kayyem serves as the faculty chair of the Homeland Security and Global Health Projects at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. Previously, she served as President Obama's Assistant Secretary at the Department of Homeland Security and as Massachusetts Governor Deval Patrick's Homeland Security Advisor. She's now an on-air CNN Senior National Security Analyst. She's also a Pulitzer Prize finalist and a contributing writer for The Atlantic and Boston's local NPR station, GBH. Professor Kayyem also consults for governors, mayors, public and private institutions on crisis management. She's a senior advisor to Teneo, a global consulting firm, and she founded her own consulting firm to support preparedness for companies, Fortune 500 companies, and startups. She was named to Inc. magazine's top 100 female founders in 2019 and received the Lifetime Achievement Pinnacle Award from the Greater Boston Chamber of Commerce in 2023. Juliette is the author and editor of 6 books, which include her most recent, The Devil Never Sleeps, Learning to Live in an Age of Disasters, which was described in a New Yorker profile as an engagingly urgent blueprint for rethinking our approach to disaster preparedness and response. Juliette lives in Cambridge, Massachusetts with her husband, Judge David Barron, and has 3 children. And with those incredible bios now read to you, I will pass my proverbial mic over to Juliette so that she can ask Daniel the hard questions.
Thanks, Shiv. Thank you. And I'm going to get the thumbs up. Everyone can hear me. I am so thrilled to be here with all of you, in particular with Daniel, but all supporters of him and NIF and this discussion, because we are heading into a big week ahead. It is true that I did Daniel's first book event. So I want to fast forward a bit because a lot has happened. In particular, obviously, the terrorist attacks by Hamas in Israel, and then the multi-year war since. In the end of the book, or in this update, because the book does update to this, you say that the events of the last 2 years are not at all entirely surprising. And yet your book in its original form is kind of optimistic. I think it's safe to say not many people are optimistic about what is going on in Israel right now, and a way forward. So I wanted to know why you thought that. And I should tell everyone your last new chapter is called "The End Is Not the End," which suggests that maybe there's a bunch more chapters.
Well, first of all, thanks, Juliette. It's so wonderful to be here doing this with you again. And thank you to so many NIFers and supporters who tuned in. The team told us before we went on that there were 760 people RSVP'd. So that's a great number. And if half of you show up, it'll be quite a feat on a Thanksgiving week. But it's good to be together. Look, in a sense, both of your questions, how do I retain, I'm not sure I would call it optimism, but let's come back to that. Plus this sense of that the events of October 7th, 2023 and subsequent events weren't particularly surprising, I think in a sense are both encapsulated in the title of that chapter. The end is not the end. There's a big mistake that we sometimes make as human beings, sort of living through history, which is, the sort of error of teleology, the idea that things are going to work out in a certain way and that's preordained. And an equal mistake is to assume that just because things are bad or good means that they're going to stay that way. And the truth is you don't know, and you never know. And if there's a lesson to be drawn from this conflict that I work on, that you have worked on, that I write about, that can be applied more universally, it's that the end is not the end. And we have, Chev mentioned in the introduction that the organization that I used to be the director of, Progressive Jewish Alliance, is now called Bend the Arc. And of course, that's taken from the famous quote attributed to MLK that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And the idea when they changed the name of the organization was that we have an obligation to bend the arc. And so I think that I try to capture that sense of agency, right? The fact is there are tens of thousands of Israelis and Palestinians who are working beneath the radar, away from the headlines every day to build a more sustainable, shared, moderate, reasonable future for everybody in the region. And, those are my people. And so at the end of the first edition of the book, I hand the proverbial microphone over to 3 of them, Palestinians, Jews, and actually a guy from Sudan, who talk about what they're doing to sort of repair what's been so badly broken. And I think that despite the fact that things are far more broken than many of us could have possibly imagined today, that opportunity, that reality, that spark of agency still exists. And so, it could be a very, very long haul. And we're definitely a marathon, not a sprint kind of an organization. But, what wasn't surprising was that with no resolution to this conflict, it will always get worse at some point. And what gives me hope is that there are people working to resolve it.
So talking about this, so we'll talk a little bit about Israel, and then we'll turn to the U.S. Israeli context.
Hmm.
So, um, I was trying to think of how to ask this. Like, what is the worst best case scenario? So let's say the best case scenario is unlikely now, right? Or at least is on the other side of the arc. But for the short term, do you see a political appetite for something that is better than this?
Well, look, if you ask Israelis, especially Israeli Jews, Israeli Palestinians, that is to say, Arab or Palestinian citizens of Israel, are much more supportive of the notion of a two-state
Yeah.
solution. But if you ask the majority of Israeli Jews, they no longer say that they support a two-state solution. The majority, by some polls, three-quarters say they don't support it, and there is evidence that there is a similar slippage in the Palestinian population in the West Bank and Gaza in support of a two-state solution. And of course, we all understand why. Um, However, when you shift the context of the question, when you sort of when you channel your inner George Lakoff, right, the linguistic, at Berkeley, who talks about sort of framing things, and when you ask people questions, and we have invested in organizations, grantee organizations, working in political psychology to figure out what it is that people really feel and what messages resonate with them. When you ask them, do you support a two-state solution? They say not anymore. But if you ask them, do you support a regional agreement of the kind that Joe Biden promoted, and for that matter, Donald Trump is occasionally promoting, then the numbers rise, and you see a majority of Israelis supporting the idea of a regional agreement which has several components, right, in all of these models, and they include full diplomatic integration and relations with Israel and the region, with the Arab League, a rebuilding of Gaza under international auspices funded by the international community, and with security guarantees for Israel, with its Western allies, and the emergence of some kind of Palestinian state in Gaza and the West Bank under the auspices of a reformed Palestinian Authority, then people support that. So even in the data, you find reasons for hope, right? We all know that you can get any result you want when you ask people. It depends on how you ask the question, but in survey after survey, it people show a majority of people, if that were on the table, a majority of Israelis say they would accept it.
Um, do you or how do you deal with the word genocide?
You just like starting off with a softball.
Yep.
Um,
Come
so
on, these people, these are educated people. I don't
they
want
are.
anything. Okay. So genocide has become this word that obviously has divided many people, and it's not just the left. There are many people in Europe and either use it more flowingly than maybe here in the U.S., but definitely the left and progressives. And I want to know sort of how, as we approach this week, how you deal with this word, its historical significance for Israel, for Jewish Americans, but also when you look at what happened in Gaza.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. It's a critically important question. And let's start by acknowledging that there are two things that we're talking about when we talk about the word genocide. And many of us are often not clear exactly what we're talking about. And the first of those things is the term coined by a Polish Jewish refugee lawyer who fled the Nazis in World War II to describe the crime that the Nazis were committing against the Jews, that the Ottoman Turks committed against the Armenians. This idea of genocide, which in the sort of popular imagination has come to mean the attempt to annihilate every member of a particular group. And of course, as you just noted, Israel was founded right as a result of the most prominent of these genocides in modern history. And so for the Jewish people who suffered that genocide, it's almost inconceivable to many of them that Israel could be accused of committing it. So first there's the kind of emotional, cognitive dissonance that comes from being accused of the term genocide as it lives in the popular imagination. But there's a second thing that genocide means, and that's actually the subject of the law, the case at the International Court of Justice, the UN's highest court, that was brought by South Africa against Israel. And that is the accusation that Israel violated the international law, the crime against humanity that's entitled genocide. And in this sense, it's not unanalogous to the word apartheid, which means one thing in our imagination, but another thing when you look at the actual treaty defining the crime of apartheid in international law. So under international law, genocide is the attempt to destroy in whole or in part a group of people who are identified by racial, religious, ethnic identities as a collective. And then there are 4 or 5 elements to that crime. And if you look at the elements to that crime, the kinds of things that the country accused of genocide or the people accused of genocide would carry out, you could find many examples in what's happened in Gaza and in many other cases around the world of the kinds of elements to the crime, the sort of things that by the way, people make the argument about the Russian invasion of Ukraine as well. What is tricky, of course, in prosecuting the crime of genocide is establishing intent, right? Did the people accused of genocide actually intend to do the thing, the elimination of a group, a whole or in part of a specific group of people? And I often point people to the case in Srebrenica during the collapse of Yugoslavia and the horrific wars that ensued. The Bosnian Serb army, right? We're bringing back the 90s here. Went to the town of Srebrenica in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and they rounded up something like 7,000 or 8,000 Bosnian Muslim men and boys. They brought them into a football stadium, a soccer stadium, and they murdered 7,000 or 8,000 people. That is one of the few cases at the ICJ where the court has actually ruled that genocide took place. And I think it's important because it wasn't millions or hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands of people. It was 7,000 or 8,000 people. That was enough to qualify as genocide. So the first question that you have to think about when you contemplate your question is, what are we talking about? Are we talking about the idea of genocide in the popular imagination, where many people understandably say, Bret Stephens in the New York Times likes to say, well, obviously Israel hasn't committed genocide because it didn't kill everybody and it could have killed everybody. But that's not actually what we're talking about. We're not talking about the notion of genocide in the popular imagination. We're talking about the crime of genocide as described in the international law that establishes it. And there, what I say to people, my friends who are defenders of Israel, who are absolutely certain that there's no possible way that Israel could have committed the crime of genocide, I say a very respected international tribunal, the ICJ, is deliberating this case right now with access to facts and evidence. In the first round of deliberations, an Israeli judge sat on that panel. And they will rule in some years, probably, about whether or not the crime of genocide was committed. Just like, a judge and a jury are going to make a determination about whether murder was committed. You might have a strong feeling sitting in the community that it was or it wasn't, or that it was defensible or that it was manslaughter. But you don't have access to all those facts. You have access to how you feel. And so what I say to my Palestinian friends and friends who support Palestinians is the same thing. There is a highly regarded international court with access to the evidence that is deliberating this matter. And for me, I'm going to wait and see what the ICJ rules on this matter. But one thing is very clear, and that is, in my opinion, that both sides in the conflict in Gaza, Hamas on October 7th and Israel in its response, committed crimes against humanity and war crimes. And you don't have to take my word for it. Listen to former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert or former Prime Minister Ehud Barak, who have said the same thing. When it comes to the word genocide, one of the things I try to do is what I just did. The problem is that's not a soundbite.
Yeah.
And it doesn't satisfy people when you say, well, what genocide are we talking about? However, that is, in my opinion, the only intellectually honest way to unpack the word.
Yeah. So bringing it forward, well, let me ask one more question just
Mhm.
quickly on this, which is, could you have, after Hamas's terrorist attack against Israel, um, could you have envisioned an Israeli response that looked different than this? Um, uh, and when was it clear to you that that wasn't happening?
Yeah, I mean, look, let's be clear. I'm not a military person. I'm
Yeah.
not Israeli, and so there's so many Monday morning quarterbacks when it comes to aspects of the conflict. I want to be careful there. I will just note that um, Israel basically on October 8th, Hezbollah in
Yeah.
Lebanon, of course, as you know, began firing at
Yeah.
Israel and at the north in solidarity with Hamas. Now, this is kind of the Israeli nightmare scenario, right?
Yeah.
That Iran's axis of resistance, so called, which includes Hamas, Hezbollah, the Syrian regime, and the Houthis and Iran itself, sort of tightens the noose. And probably that was part of the calculations of Sinwar and Hamas leadership when they launched October 7th, was the belief that somehow this would spark a bigger war. And it started on October 8th. And of course, what we saw happen was, by the end of that round of Israeli Hezbollah conflict, which was, much later in the 2 years that the war lasted, Israel had almost completely decapitated Hezbollah as the organization that it once was, with hundreds of thousands of missiles that could reach anywhere in Israel, with all these incredibly well-trained fighters. They were able to dispatch the leadership. They assassinated the leadership of Hezbollah deep in a bunker in southern Beirut suburbs. They destroyed much of the leadership. There was the much vaunted pager and cell
Yeah.
phone attack. They managed to destroy missiles and missile launchers, and they did that with, of course, there were civilian casualties in South Beirut, but they were nothing even remotely approaching what we saw in Gaza. So it seems to me that, Israel has the capacity to respond in many different ways to
Mhm.
perceived threats. And one of the reasons that the carnage in Gaza was what it was is because that was part of the rationale in the response.
Yeah.
For me and for a lot of people, I think that by the end of 2023, there were huge concerns about the proportionality of the Israeli response, some of which we began hearing around that time from the Biden administration.
Yeah. So, okay, so let's come back to everyone's dinner table in a few weeks. So, um,
A
you did
few
a
weeks,
great
Juliet? I mean,
uh,
that may be
a
wishful
few
thinking on your
days,
part,
a
but it's
few
on
days,
Thursday.
a few days. Oh my gosh. So you have, I mean, you did this a great discussion of the word genocide. I'm not telling you anything you don't already know, but um, the word anti-Semitic has equally been used as a sword and a shield in many ways. And I wonder how you think about the term, both literally, what does it mean? And then this more sweeping use of the term to silence, and people will experience this, I think, this week, is, a younger generation of Jewish our kids, so to speak, much less, let's say, much more critical of Israel, and it's hard to call them anti-Semitic.
Right. I mean, and many of them are Jewish, right?
I mean,
Yeah,
that's what
right.
as I joke, like one of the unspoken things is like half of the major student organizations are run by Jewish American students.
Yeah. So look, I mean, this is a tough one. In the first edition of this book, I have I have a chapter called the A word, or maybe it's called the
Yeah,
other A word, because I
yeah,
deal with both apartheid that I mentioned earlier and anti-Semitism. And I wrote something along the lines of anti-Zionism or anti-Israelism isn't anti-Semitic except when it is, right?
yeah,
And I don't mean to be glib, I mean to be accurate. And so it's really tough to sort of pull those apart. And a lot of smart people, my friend Rabbi Jill Jacobs, who runs an organization called Shua, has done really good work on how you pull apart and tease apart what is anti-Semitic, what is anti-Zionist, what is anti-Israel. It's massively complicated, of course, because the conflation of Jews and Israel happens in all kinds of quarters, right? It happens in the folks attacking Israel who will often say, well, we're anti-Zionist, we're not anti-Semitic, and then they will conflate Jews and Israel, which is anti-Semitism. My youngest kid, who of course you know well, goes to a liberal arts college, and at Hanukkah I guess it was probably 2023, she and some other kids were lighting a Hanukkah menorah outside on campus, and someone opened a window in a dorm behind them, and this kid shouted out "Free Palestine." And my daughter said, Dad, I believe in free Palestine and a two-state solution and equality, but it felt like, and I don't think there's anything anti-Semitic when people demand that, and I don't think there's anything inherently anti-Semitic by protesters chanting "Free Palestine." I would like to see the occupation over and the war end, and Israel and Palestine living side by side. She said, but when a kid opens her dorm window and shouts it at a bunch of Jewish Californians lighting a Hanukkah menorah, that feels wrong to me. It feels anti-Semitic. And I said, you nailed it. That is the distinction between what is, and of course we would say that's kind of misdemeanor anti-Semitism. It gets a lot worse than that. But the problem is really, now we see in the right wing, in the Tucker Carlson, Nick Fuentes universe, just as on the kind of, for lack of a better term, hard left, you see a similar conflation with those guys just talking about the big problem being the American, the establishment institutions of American Jewry, organized American Jewry, says Nick Fuentes. That's like prima facie first degree anti-Semitism, but it's complicated further by the fact that the government of Israel and defenders of Israel also make the same conflation. And if you criticize Israel, you are called an anti-Semite. It really doesn't matter if you are, a Palestinian who's criticizing Israel, or me, an American Jewish guy who's devoted his life to the place. We are, in the eyes of the current government of Israel, anti-Semites. Maybe in my case, a self-hating anti-Semite. So with all this, heat and light, it's really difficult to really make the distinction. And that's why I refer everyone to Zoe's careful observation at her college campus, right? When you are accusing Jews in this country of being responsible for the actions of Israel, a foreign country, it's not really, despite the fact that, of course, it's complicated by there being institutions that claim to represent the American Jewish community, but they're unelected, self-selected organizations claiming to speak on behalf of the American Jewish community, and the Israeli government also claiming to speak and act, on behalf of and in defense of Jews around the world. It's really tough. But when you are accusing Jews around the world of being responsible for Israel's actions, either because you're ignorant and you don't know any better, or because you're looking for an excuse, that's rank anti-Semitism. And it's not terribly different from what we saw during COVID in cities like mine and yours and in New York, when Chinese Americans or people who were perceived to be Chinese Americans were attacked and blamed for COVID, or after 9/11, when Arab and Muslim Americans and sometimes Sikh Americans were attacked and blamed for what bin Laden did. So, that's called racism and in our case, anti-Semitism. And it is really hard work to distinguish between the two when the powers that be, whether in Israel or the American government, or in some circles on the left and in some circles on the right, are intentionally making that conflation. But we can do better.
Yeah, I mean, the New Israel Fund sits in a interesting place in American discourse, and I'm curious. I've always wanted to ask you this: like, have you been surprised at I think ADL may be the best example of this, of the sort of dilution of anti-Semitism that I think it's fair to say has led to the term not having the import that it should have, right? You call someone anti-Semitic, it should have the force of that horror.
Right.
But secondly, I think if you look at the polling, and you and I talked about when this polling came out, yes, I'm going to excuse the left wing anti-Semites, excuse me, put them to the side, and the right wing
Not excuse them.
anti-Semites, right?
Yeah, right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like, okay, but the narrative has been lost for the vast majority of Americans now. And I'm just curious if you've had a chance to reflect. I know we're in the middle of it. Reflect on it, and how do we unwind that?
Yeah, look, I mean, first of all, like let's be very clear. You can criticize Israel even fiercely and not be a Jew hater,
Yeah.
right? You can even believe, as increasingly some prominent American political figures believe, that there shouldn't be any kind of ethno-nationalist states or religious states or any state that privileges one citizen over another because of an immutable characteristic of their birth, be that Israel, Pakistan, Iran, Saudi Arabia, or any country that does that, without being an anti-Semite. It doesn't mean that you're not an anti-Semite. It just means that that's not a defining characteristic. When it comes to the the organizations, that as you've suggested, have contributed to the dilution of the word. They're not, I don't believe, responsible for it. They're contributors, like all the other
Yes.
players that we just named, who are conflating these things. Um, Once again, for the second time in this half hour, I will tell you I am not surprised by it.
Okay.
And that's because, um, without getting into a long history of the American Jewish establishment's development, uh, suffice it to say that since the establishment of the state of Israel, which of course followed close upon the Holocaust, World War II, the major institutions of the American Jewish community have devoted themselves to Israel's security. And that has, for some of those institutions, and certainly understandably from the position of where they were then, and for many of those institutions, regardless of what they describe their primary purpose as being, it has become the sine qua non, the real reason for existence of many of these organizations. And they have contributed in many cases, as you're suggesting, to the dilution of the power of the horror of the word anti-Semitism by using it or implying it or explicitly accusing people of it when they oppose Israel or Israeli policy. And of course, I don't think that's a good thing. There is a powerful response that is coming up in the community now. There's an organization called Nexus that is monitoring anti-Semitism, and looking at it in a different way. That is very much a watchdog organization, but also being very careful not to make the conflation, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes, again, criticism of Israel, protesting of Israel, is in fact either anti-Semitic or a camouflage for anti-Semitism, and many times it's not. And so Nexus is making the careful attempt to really surgically look at what is anti-Semitism, isolate that, and go after it, rather than throwing into the pool. When you have an anti-Semitism statistic that a major organization compiles, and you're counting anti-Israel protests on college campuses without exception, there's a problem there. And there's also, from the other side, some of those protests actually did tumble into anti-Semitism, yes. And many of them didn't. So again, there's nothing easy about this, and what it requires, luckily we have hundreds of NIF supporters on the call, so they're no strangers to the idea that, like, when it comes to this stuff, as I write in the book, we're not operating with blacks and whites. We're operating in the shades of gray and with nuances. And these are likely unsatisfactory answers for many people at a moment in our culture and our society who demand the soundbite and the quick answer. But in fact, these are complex issues that require real thoughtful approaches. And so when it comes to anti-Semitism, when it comes to your Thanksgiving table, my friends, try not to lob the accusation of anti-Semitism to the left or the right, unless you're really sure that person hates Jews.
Right, exactly. Well, so what I want to, this isn't a round robin, but let's, this in a few days, people will be at tables that probably merge or have a range of generations, and we've seen the data on the generational shift, range of politics, and even interfaith. So I should tell people I'm an interfaith family. My husband and in-laws who we're spending it with are Jewish, and my kids are Jewish. And I am Arab American. So, okay, so one thought is
you're like the NIF in one human.
I know. It's like, I'm a counterterrorism expert. So, like, literally,
Right,
love it,
right.
babe, love it. So, uh, okay, one inclination is this is off limits, and especially given the generational, which I think is
Yeah.
at least anecdotally is probably the most extreme one. Or difficult one. What's your recommendation for honest
Right.
dialogue?
Well, the funny thing about the off limits, like that kind of so goes against,
Yeah.
everything that you and I kind of feel. And yet, one has to acknowledge that it might have its place. I was asked to consult at the sort of after the first year of this war with a wonderful progressive Jewish summer camp. And they said, what are we going to do about our Israel education? And we have these counselors coming from Israel, and we have, American counselors who are part of the protest movement at their colleges, and we have donors in the community who are one place, and we have other. And I said, if I were you, I would say we can't do this summer.
Yeah.
Because not because we're cowards or because we don't think it's important, but because what's the line? This is why we can't have nice things. Like people in the community cannot have civil conversation. And we're a Jewish summer camp, right? We're not the New Israel Fund or a debate society, or, we're just a place that's trying to inculcate a love of Judaism amongst, kids. And so I think that the expectation that everyone can and should and is prepared to have this conversation, it turns out is probably a misguided expectation. And sometimes I do think it's okay to say, you know what, to preserve the peace, because we're not prepared. We just we're not going to talk about it. Now, most of us on this call are not going to do that. So I my dear friend and the former chair of the board of the New Israel Fund, Professor David Myers,
Yes.
who is a professor at UCLA, who you of course know. David sort of developed. So after October 7th, both he and I, with Arab and Palestinian colleagues and friends, did a lot of speaking at universities. He at his own and some others, and I with another mutual friend of ours, Salam al-Mariati of the Muslim Public Affairs Council.
Mm-hmm.
We spoke at universities and other venues as well. And one of the things that David shared with me, and I just still find it to be incredibly useful. You would think that this is intuitive, but it turns out it's not at all. He sort of has these guidelines for this kind of conversation, whether on a campus or amongst a professional organization, or maybe even at your own Thanksgiving table. And David, forgive me if you're on the call, because I'm gonna paraphrase these beautiful points which you say so much more eloquently. But he says, look, there have to be some ground rules when we enter into this conversation, and he clarifies what they are. And I, following his excellent example, now do the same when Salam and I, or when I, or speak about these things. And they are, you have to approach this, try to approach the conversation with real humility, right? You don't know everything. And one of the problems with this conflict, and again, I open the book up with something like this, is that there are very few conflicts in the world that people feel so emotionally and so strongly about that they actually don't know as much as they think they do about it. And that's offensive to say out loud. It's hard for a lot of people to hear, but I always liken it to the parable of the blind men and the elephant, right? Who each one, they encounter the elephant in the jungle, and each one feels a bit of the elephant and is certain that he now knows what an elephant is. Of course, an elephant is a long, sinewy, trunk-like appendage. No, the elephant is a tree trunk-like leg. No, the elephant is a flappy ear. And what's poignant about the story is that none of them are wrong. Right there, what they have experienced is part of the elephant, of course, but what you can't see is that there's a whole elephant, and there are lots of stories and lots of descriptions of different parts of the elephant. I'll stop with the metaphor. You get the point. But at the Thanksgiving table, or at the university campus, or at the, Salam and I have spoken with professional organizations representing psychologists, therapists, people who we expect to help us resolve conflicts have brought us in to help them resolve this one. And so the first thing is have the humility to know that you don't know everything, and also understand that just as number two, just as you feel so emotionally, so too does the person with whom you're speaking or likely arguing, right? And that's because these are deeply ingrained issues of identity. For some of us, when it comes to ourselves or our loved ones or our friends, it's literally matters of life and death, right? The people who are over there in Gaza or in Israel. But for most people who are having this level of emotion in the conversation, there is something connected to our own sense of self. So you have to approach it with real humility and respect for that deep emotion, as well as real curiosity, right? Try to be curious, try to be open-minded. I find approaching anything having to do with this work with humility and curiosity to be a game changer. Because you really do see, oh, okay, this person is speaking from a place of fear, of pain, of what they have been taught from their rabbis or imams or priests and grandparents and parents and the news that they have read and consumed and the books and popular culture, and they are seeing part of the elephant, but they're not seeing the whole elephant. And so, my advice for everyone is try to step back and see as much of the elephant as you can. Be respectful and curious and compassionate, understanding that people have deeply emotional connections to these issues, and be curious. Or rather, I said that one. Have humility, right? Understand that you don't know everything, and nor does the person that you're talking to. The last thing David and I always say, which you might not have time to do before Thanksgiving, is try to educate yourself. Right? The more that you know, the more that you've read, the more that you understand, away from the people who are filtering you, the information that is confirming your biases, the better off you'll be in terms of being prepared for these conversations.
Yeah. So, okay, I'm going to turn to a whole bunch of questions. I'm going to merge them, paraphrase them, just so we can get to as many as possible. So there's a series of questions about words. So I think that's a safe way. I'm looking at here. So Israeli supremacy, Jewish supremacy, and then on the other, ethnic cleansing. So we talked about genocide, and in particular, possibly what's happening in the West Bank on ethnic cleansing. So I sort of view these in totality, where these sort of simplistic sort of lobs are thrown into a conversation. So what do you make of these terms? And then how can we, to your point, is like, how can we sort of unpack it in a meaningful way?
Well, it's human nature to want to compare things to other things to understand them. And a board member of mine once said many, many years ago, long before October 7th, about one of these words that was attempting to find an analogy. She said, "It's bad enough what it is." She was talking about the occupation on the West Bank, without resorting to without employing a sort of a imperfect historical analogy. And I think that there's a lot of wisdom to that, because it also kind of ratchets things down. Now, you have a problem when you come to words like genocide and apartheid, and it's the problem that I already mentioned, is that there are the descriptions, which are usually the sort of popular imagination, which no matter who you are and on what side you're on, you can find ways of saying that doesn't fit, right? But then there's law, international law, to be sure, but law nonetheless. And in the case of the words apartheid and genocide, in addition to the popular conceptions of those words, there are laws there are crimes with elements, just like a crime in our own system. And you can sort of look at what the elements of the crime are, and if intent can be established, then those crimes have been committed. So I guess, not to be glib, I included in the book, and I updated, there's a final section of the book called The Lexicon of the Conflict, which tries to do exactly what you just asked. So I spent a lot of time on it. I tried to compile a lexicon to help with exactly this issue. By the way, one of my daughters looked at the lexicon and said, "Dad, why did you need to write the rest of the book? This is really good. What do you need the rest of the book for?" So fair. So if you don't do anything else, you can refer to the lexicon, which tries to take on exactly this issue of unpacking the words. The problem is, This is like a theme throughout our talk. One of my very favorite uh, reviews of the book was actually an interview that I did with one of the Sunday papers in Canada. I think it was the Toronto Star, and they did like a big. It was the featured, in the magazine or book review section. It was the feature, and I did an interview with a reporter. And at one point, and they pulled a quote that I had said to put on the as the headline, and I loved it. It just said, "My answer is not a soundbite." And again, it's this theme that if you're us, the hundreds of us on this call, you, me, we all understand that there is no easy way to just give a yes or a no. This word yes, this word no. And so what I've tried to do in the book and what I try to do in my career and when I speak to people is to not shy away from the nuance, but to dive into it and to unpack this stuff. I'll tell you a very quick little anecdote. Soon after October 7th, a very, very prominent journalist who has a kind of an online news service, which I like a lot, contacted me and said, someone sent me a copy of your book. It looks great. I'm going to read it. But for now, can you explain to me what Hamas is and how they got to where they're? Now, that may sound crazy to people now, but this was in October of 2023. And I said, okay. And I started to, and 20 seconds in, 30 seconds in, this person said, wait a minute, Daniel, this is very interesting. And I will read the book, but you don't understand. I need a soundbite. Like I can't take 90 seconds to do this. And I said to this person, well, I'm just not your guy, right? There are people who can do that, I'm sure, but not me. What I am able to do is to help walk with you through the complexity and the nuance. So read the lexicon, unpack the words, and the last tip I'll give for that. Another word that comes up a lot is Zionism, right? Yeah. And one of the things that I now say when people ask me, "Are you a Zionist?" Now that's rarely a neutral question.
Yeah,
it's usually an
if they're
accusation.
asking.
Yeah, if they're asking, right? So if I'm asked if I'm a Zionist by a person, when I'm giving a talk at a university, and some kid in a keffiyeh and sunglasses and a surgical mask, asks if I'm a Zionist, or if I'm, in Israel giving a talk and a guy in a certain kind of sized yarmulke dressed in a certain way asks if I'm a Zionist. In the case of the first person, it's an accusation. And in the case of the second person, it's a demand for a loyalty oath. But neither of them wants to know what I think about the 19th century idea and the movement that was developed in support of the idea that the Jewish people require self-determination in its ancient homeland. That's Zionism. So and of course words change and they evolve and they develop, like literally, which now means both what we were taught it means and its exact opposite, figuratively. And so of course Zionism now means different things than that 19th century definition, but it means so many different things to so many different people that I find it completely unhelpful to even engage with it. So when someone asks me that question, I say, why don't you tell me the question you really want me to answer? Do I think Israel has a right to exist? Do I support the moves of the Israeli government? Do I think that the Jewish people deserve self-determination? Do I think so? So ask me the question that you want to know the answer to, and I'll give you my answer, and we can discuss it or debate it. But by me answering yes or no to your demand that I accept or deny a label that you and I don't agree on the meaning of is not practical. So I think that that's my kind of tip at the Thanksgiving table, whether it's Zionism or any of the other words that we're discussing. Let's get to the heart of what the question is really about. What do you really want to know?
Well, first of all, that there's a good follow on in the that I'm reading. I did want to say to people there's a vibrant discussion, which I assume is true of the NIF. I am not the talent, as they say, so I will not reply. But I know the team at NIF is looking at these and will reply back, and we obviously won't be able to get to all of them. But okay, so. I'm going to call you on the paradox that you just, or the contradiction, because we've been friends a long time. So on the one hand, you tell the Jewish camp off the table, can't do it. These kids are only together for 6 weeks.
By the way, they didn't listen to me, and apparently it went okay. So there you go.
Well, that gets to it, which is like there's truths that also need to be addressed. Like, in other words, by deciding not to engage it, you're not either, either the silence can perpetuate untruths, right? As someone said,
Yeah.
whether it goes to Israel's founding, right, or its current actions. And I will, tell you anecdotally, for those of you who probably experienced the same thing on this line, it was a very difficult 2 years for me because people that I thought had an understanding of I think the complexities really fell into camps hard,
Yeah.
and made me not want to talk about this because I was pretty early on discussing at least the nature of the war against the Palestinians. And I'm curious, like, we've all lost friends or have had difficult conversations, like, you know, it's the extremes of silence and then not soundbite
Yeah.
allows
Yeah.
for untruths to fester.
Yeah, no, well put. And of course, as you well know, silence is not my choice, right? Like,
Yeah.
I believe in the green room for this conversation. You said, don't worry. I always know Daniel can keep talking if he
Yeah.
needs to.
Yeah.
So,
That was
so
not.
I'm not saying I recommend silence. I was noting that things are so tough for so many people who don't want to do or who can't do or who haven't done or who perhaps think they've done the work of educating themselves. Number 5 of David Meyer's, requirements for intelligent conversation, that sometimes, not having the conversation could be an option. It's not where I fall, right? Obviously. And like I said, the camp didn't even agree. They didn't take my advice at the time, and good for them. So I don't think I think that's a very temporary thing if you don't want to get into a screaming match with your great uncle, right? Like maybe not talking about this can be helpful. But I certainly don't think that's the answer. I think the answer is to approach things the way that David, recommends.
Yes.
I'll just say one other thing. None of us have to defend the indefensible.
Right.
Right. And one of the things that's broken my heart, I think a lot about you and your family over these last 2 years, and you're not unique or alone. You happen to be an extreme example of like an Arab Jewish family where someone's a security expert. But like there are all kinds of mixed families, by the way, totally Jewish or totally Arab that are mixed in terms of how they feel about the conflict.
Yes.
I think that one thing I would urge us is that we don't have to have a blind allegiance to tribe, and we don't have to defend the indefensible. And, you could see people twisting themselves into contortions right after October 7th. I did many interviews with mainstream American press, because people wanted to know what people like me thought about some folks in the, let's call it the racial and social justice movement, there were some people who were celebrating and justifying and defending what Hamas had done, but there were other people who were kind of turning themselves into pretzels to try to, again, justify it or explain it. And my feeling was, you don't have to ever defend the indefensible. You can look carefully at the root causes for why something happened without trying to justify that thing once it's already happened. And then, of course, when it came to the Israeli response in my own community, I saw it, just as intensely. You saw people trying to, and what happens is you end up diminishing the suffering of others. You end up questioning the veracity of the horror. You say there weren't rape and sex crimes committed on October 7th, or you say it's all Pallywood, as some people say, and Israel clearly didn't do the things, by the way, that many Israelis have acknowledged that Israel's done. And so you end up, you don't need to defend the indefensible. That's thing one. And the other thing is something that Dr. Yasmin Abu Frecha, who's a board member of NIF, once said. When she said it to me on October 8th. And she's a Bedouin Israeli doctor who was in the Soroka hospital in the Negev, the biggest hospital in the south of Israel, treating, for hours and days, people who were coming in victims of the terror attack. Kids from the rave, kibbutznikim, soldiers, Bedouins who had been hurt, foreign workers, Thai workers in the fields. And as she told me that she looked around the operating room at her colleagues, and they were Jewish, Palestinian, Arab, Christian, Muslim, Druze, and she had this moment, this epiphany. And she said, it's not a conflict between Arabs and Jews or Israelis and Palestinians. It's between people who believe that violence is a legitimate means of achieving their ideological or political ends, and those of us who say, no, human life is more important than that. And I think that there's a great clarity and comfort for me in saying, that's my camp, that's my tribe.
Yeah. I love that that no tribe is required to defend the indefensible. I think that's a nice way to end with Heidi. Heidi Bennett asked a question, which I think a lot of people will experience, especially maybe after Thanksgiving. But is what is Jewishness, right? Because there's many people on this call who don't want to defend the political actions of Israel, or Israel's treatment of the Palestinians even, but feel that they need to explain it.
Yeah.
I hope that was a fair paraphrase, but why don't I just read Heidi's question to make sure? Every time someone finds out I'm Jewish, I need to explain that I don't support Israel's treatment of the Palestinians. My daughter also has this issue. What's the best response to define Jewishness and Israel's current Zionism taking all the land, that taking all the land aren't the same?
Yeah, I mean, Heidi, that's a great question. And I mean, hopefully some of what we've discussed in this last hour is useful to you. But I guess, again, I would say that, just as, I will only speak for two people on this Zoom, and that's you and me, Juliette. I think we are two people who consider ourselves patriotic Americans, right? With a real commitment and love of the best of our ideals as a country. And we're, now I'll only speak for myself, and so many of us are horrified by what our country looks like now and where we've come and what we've become and how we're perceived in the eyes of the world. And I think that it's an imperfect analogy because Israel and Judaism get mixed up. But I think but I think it's useful in saying I will never try to defend or justify or explain things that this country does when I think they're wrong. It is a painful and difficult thing to criticize your tribe, but it's also a courageous and necessary thing. And when it comes to Israel and Judaism, I would say to the person who asks, if they're asking in good faith, how do you as a Jew feel about what Israel's doing? I think what I would say is I'm as opposed to it as I am to what my own country is doing. And in fact, as I do in my own personal life here in Israel, my job is to support the tens of thousands of Israelis, Jewish and Palestinian, who are opposed, who are fighting, who are calling for an end to the war, an end to the occupation, who are trying to build a better and shared future within Israel and between Israel and its Palestinian neighbors. And that is something that we don't often see, but that is as real as the pronouncements coming out of the Israeli government, or for that matter, the White House. And I reject the idea that I have to defend those things. I absolutely won't. And, this is a longer conversation and one that there are people far more qualified than me to engage in. I dropped out of rabbinical school after 3 months, but the idea, we were talking about the Jewish organizations and how they have predicated everything on defense of Israel. Well, they also contributed to building an American Jewish identity in which Israel was totally central. And, and whether or not you're someone like me who runs the New Israel Fund, or you're someone like, the screaming great uncle who is, any criticism of Israel is unacceptable. Israel's really central in our lives. And that also doesn't have to be the case, right? Israel and the relationship to the land is important in Jewish tradition, but there are many pathways within the Jewish religion and the Jewish, Jewish life, and they don't all have to be centered around your personal relationship and identity with Israel. And I think that it is perfectly fine for Heidi and her daughter to say to people, "Oh, I'm proud to be Jewish, and I'm even proud to support those Israelis who are resisting and fighting what's happening." But that I'm not going to defend what Israel does when I don't agree with it.
Yeah. Wow, 2:59. We could have talked a lot longer. I want to thank, well, first of all, everyone for being on. That's actually, you could thank them. I want to thank you for the opportunity. And you gave me, I was taking notes. You gave me some things for my couple of days ahead. I may be in the and let's get through dinner camp, but I think my family is proof that multiple opinions can all still love and love each other and spend time together.
And you can also text me if you need me during dinner.
My father-in-law. Yeah.
Well, I want to thank you both. I want to thank
Thank
you,
you.
Juliette, for having this conversation with all of us, and Daniel for sharing so much of the book and especially the new parts of the book. For this whole conversation, and the recording will be available to everybody who attended. And I really do think that we all, learned a great deal from both of you today, and we'll be able to go into this holiday season a bit more informed, a bit more confident, and with just that much more complexity and nuance. And so with that, you can see in the link, in the chat that we've sent a link. So if you'd like to buy the book, and with the new edition, and we will see you all back here, hopefully after Thanksgiving, for more conversations like this one. And it's been such a pleasure. So until next time, thank you both.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Chev.
Happy
Juliette, thank you so
Thanksgiving.
much.
Thank you, guys.
Bye, everyone. Happy Thanksgiving.
Bye.